Hello everyone, welcome to the final lecture of the course and of the term. It's our second week on Deleuze and Guattari, and we're moving from anti-Oedipus to 1,000 Plateaus, and we're going to be looking at a specific chapter or plateau, which is year zero, faciality. And for the first time, I'm not giving you a picture of the thinkers on the front slide. That's Alfred E. Newman from Mad Magazine, whose face has been plastered onto the body of Christ, which is central to this topic that we're going to look at today, and you'll see why. Now, one of the important things to keep in mind there is that this image, this somewhat twisted image of what historically many people consider to be a very holy and solemn scene, is not a defacement of Christ, but a defacialization of Christ, or of the Christ figure, or of the Christ face. So it's humorous, but it's serious at the same time. It has to do with the politics of the face and the politics of defacialization, which we'll look at. So, very quick, the lecture structure. We're going to look at some of the key terminology in 1,000 Plateaus. I won't go over too much, really, the terminology from anti-Oedipus, but this is going to be terminology that builds on that, so I may refer back to some of it. Then we'll look at the three stratifications that are outlined, throughout the text of 1,000 Plateaus. Two of which play an important role, specific role in the faciality plateau, but all three of them are actually important for understanding the faciality plateau. Before we look at the idea of faciality as an abstract machine, and you'll know what that is because we're going to look at the key terminology first before we get to that section. Then despotic faces versus authoritarian faces, the role of Christ in the capitalist faciality machine, and then we'll look at the last part will be dismantling the face. And as I say, the main reading is just year zero faciality. It's about a 25-page chapter or plateau of the text. So it's not a long piece. I think the longest chapter is around 75 pages. There's a few of them that are in the 50 to 75 page range. But in some ways it's considered the hardest plateau, but since I feel like I've written on it and done pretty well on it, that's one of the reasons I wanted to give it to you. There is, amongst the secondary literature, I should say, a chapter that I've written on faciality plateau, which is in a text that Henry Summers Hall was one of the co-editors for, called 1,000 Plateaus in Philosophy. That, I will say, is the best chapter in the book, obviously, for obvious reasons. But let's begin. Key terminology in 1,000 Plateaus. Now, the text itself is a follow-up to Anti-Oedipus. It's published about 8 years later, 1980. It's an attempt to put into practice the kind of experimental thinking that's called for in Anti-Oedipus. So it offers a schizoanalysis and attempted deterritorializations across a whole domain of fields that are covered by the text: politics, ethics, aesthetics, literature, art, science, linguistic theory, much more. There's 15 chapters. One of them is kind of a glossary of terms at the very end of the text. So 14 kind of substantive domains are explored, and they include all of those areas. A schizoanalysis, which is an analysis of desire understood as schizophrenic, from Anti-Oedipus. So desire is understood again as not a teleological process and not based on a lack, but based upon an idea of connections. Desire is the proliferation of connections that psychoanalysis has often overlaid with, simply has overlaid with, an Oedipus complex in order to convict desire and lead it to desire its own repression. That's part of the role that psychoanalysis plays in a modern liberal capitalist society. So schizoanalysis, so it's focused on an analysis of desire understood as productive and understood as the production and proliferation of connections, and an attempted deterritorialization of these different domains. So deterritorialization as in a coming undone of the formations of desire in each of these fields. Deterritorializations which can often lead to reterritorialization, so on, as we saw in the last week. But that's the role here. Experiments in all of these different domains. Whereas Anti-Oedipus was quite focused on analysis of capital, analysis of psychoanalysis, and the question of fascism in contemporary society, in post-war Western society. So the key to the analysis of these various domains is the concept of the rhizome in its relation to the tree. So rhizomes and trees, that's the opening plateau, is on the rhizome. Rhizome might sound like a fancy word, it might sound like an esoteric word, it might sound like a piece of jargon, but you eat them all the time, and cook with them if you cook. Rhizomes are plants, and ginger and turmeric are examples of them. You cook with ginger a lot, I'm sure. If you do any cooking, you probably cook with ginger. These are plants whose stems grow horizontally rather than vertically, often underground, and they send out shoots that go above ground, and they send out roots below. And so that is compared to, Deleuze and Guattari say, an arboreal conception or a tree conception, where trees have roots that go out from a trunk and branches that go out from a trunk. So a tree is a certain kind of model, Deleuze and Guattari will say, of thinking and of kind of understanding and organizing the world, where there's plurality, multiple branches, multiple roots, but they ultimately converge in some sense onto a center. So it's a multiplicity, a plurality that always refers back to a unity. Whereas the rhizome is a decentered plurality, because a rhizome has no central trunk to it. It can just spread and proliferate. So it's like desire, right? It's a horizontal proliferation, because it's often underground but horizontal to the surface of the ground. No fixed center and no limit, and proliferating. Now, Deleuze and Guattari will basically counterpose these two notions as two different notions of thinking. And our standard everyday form of thinking is tree-like or arboreal. This is the way in which we divide up the world. This is the way we think about things, classify things. That's the tree model is a model that is consistent with a representational schematization of the world. So from the earlier weeks, all the stuff we talked about, the non-identical, the Jews with a small j, Foucault's notions of otherness, all of these are concepts of difference that would exceed the tree model because they exceed the terms of representation. They cannot be represented themselves. The tree model is one model of thought compared to this other model of thought, which is the rhizome. Now sometimes, in reality, these two things mix together, and that's the bottom picture. That's Pando, an aspen garden in Utah, or aspen grove, in Utah, which is the world's, as far as we know, the world's largest living organism. Because although that's a bunch of trees, that's one tree. Genetic testing has shown that they're all the same tree, which seem to be connected by the root system. Although I guess we haven't formally, strictly speaking, chewed up the ground and checked to make sure that they're all connected. But it's a grove of trees, seemingly trees, that's formed a rhizome. So they're one organism, connected. So sometimes the trees are the rhizomes, and I guess sometimes the rhizomes are the trees. I guess I've already said this. Two different images of thought. And one of the central points of 1,000 Plateaus is to try and rethink all of these domains, taking them away from a tree-based analysis. We're tired of trees. They've made us suffer too much. That's kind of at the heart of the project of 1,000 Plateaus. as an extension of the kind of experimental thinking from Anti-Oedipus. The first part of the experiment is to think along the same kind of understanding that was presented with desire in the earlier text. Desiring machines in the earlier text are rhizomes. That's the form in which they take. Because in a rhizome also, anything can be connected to anything else. There's no necessity to any of the particular connections. And rhizomes are always connections of heterogeneities, just like desire is an assemblage of heterogeneous components that function through their strife and friction. Okay? So these rhizomes, as systems of dispersed and interwoven differences, and dispersed in the Foucauldian sense of dispersion, where they're heterogeneous but mixed together, rather than just scattered into some empty space, they form assemblages. And the assemblages are horizontal, and they're machinic, in the same way in which machinic was used in the previous text, as consisting of heterogeneous parts that function in the first instance through their connection, but also through the strife and friction that comes from there being heterogeneities that are connected together. So they comprise connections and points of friction, and they come to function or work that way. They do something. And what matters in the analysis is not what they mean, but how they work. Rhizomes are assemblages, just like desire was an assemblage from from Anti-Oedipus. These assemblages are stratified in diverse ways. Now, stratifications, the term really comes from geology, from the idea of geological strata, which are layers, right? Layers of earth that have different ages, but they form a hierarchy, I suppose you could say. Stratifications are, and you could also think of them as social strata, as I mentioned here. So that's the famous pyramid of capitalism, where all the workers are on the bottom holding up these ever-increasing minority, but of more and more elite, wealthy people. And so it's a social pyramid. Stratifications are hierarchical organizations of assemblages. The assemblages are horizontal, but they're made vertical by being stratified, and the stratifications impose and operate according to some kind of principle of identity or representation. And what these strata do are they capture, so to speak. They're known as apparatuses of capture in the text that code and territorialize. So that's where we have deterritorialization. Deterritorialization is what will escape these stratifications. What the stratifications do in creating these hierarchies, in kind of pulling these flattened assemblages into a kind of layered hierarchy, is they seek to capture and control fugitive differences that would escape and therefore undermine the very kinds of hierarchies the strata work to establish. So just like in the earlier text, desire had to be repressed in a certain kind of way to maintain a social hierarchy, this is what stratifications are. Stratifications are the constructions of the social hierarchies from rhizomatic assemblages, desire being a rhizomatic assemblage. Now, rhizomes form assemblages, and these assemblages are machinic. And what these machinic assemblages effectuate or realize, effectuate is the term used in the text, are abstract machines. So abstract machines are effectuated in machinic assemblages, which we could also say are stratified and territorialized, or territorial assemblages. Abstract machines are realized or effectuated, or you could even say incarnated or embodied in these assemblages, these hierarchical organizations that work by principles of identity and representation. Now, the abstract machines themselves are diagrammatic, which is to say that they can be mapped. And ultimately what they are diagrams of force relations that are incarnated, brought into being in these hierarchical assemblages. Now, it's a diagram is a map. It's not a tracing. The difference is a tracing is representational. So if you took a picture and you put a piece of paper over it and you traced it, that would be with the idea of getting an identical, copy of the picture. Tracings are always representational. They're more or less accurate based on how well they trace out the thing that they're copying. A map does not have to be a representation. Maps can be, for example, this is a Mercator projection map of the world. We all know how distorted it is in the north and the south, right? Alaska and Greenland are not that big. Africa is not that small. But Mercator projections are useful maps. They're incredibly useful for navigation because the shortest distance is always a straight line. And you could think of it again. It doesn't matter that it's not a good representation. What matters is that it works, that it's effective, that you can do something with it. That's the way that's the way assemblages and machines are to be assessed in Deleuze and Guattari's analysis. So, another example is a tube map, right? The tube map is not at all drawn to scale. It's, made of straight lines, and the actual tube tracks and tunnels are not straight. But they work, they're useful for navigating. So the abstract machines are diagrammatic, and what they are diagrams of force relations. And force relations are, or some kind of regime of force relations get realized in stratified assemblages of desire, or stratified rhizomes. I hope that terminology makes sense. And that's, again, what the analysis is going to be. So the analysis of capitalism will include what are the diagrammatic abstract machines that are realized in capitalism. Some configuration of forces is realized in a capitalist society, in a liberal society, etc. These configurations of forces themselves can be mapped. They kind of underpin the assemblages and make them work the way that they work. So it's also a notion that you can find in Foucault. Foucault refers to disciplinary society, something that can be diagrammed or mapped out. And again, disciplinary society rests upon a configuration, and normalizing society in Foucault rests upon a configuration of micro relations of force that realize themselves in macro relations. Deleuze, in his book on Foucault, that's a figure, draws a diagram. And that's one of the diagrams he draws. I think that it might be the only diagram he draws in the Foucault book, which admittedly looks like a zit or a blackhead or a pimple. But that's actually meant to be a diagram of the force of subjectivation in Foucault, by which Deleuze is referring to the practices of the self in Foucault, the care of the self in the last period of his work, the self-to-self relation, which Deleuze sees as involving force and power, but folding it in such a way that it creates this resistance to stratifications, to identity-oriented constructions that gather together differences. Right? Discipline works by stratification, and we'll see that in the Faciality Plateau as well. And those configurations, the configurations of those stratifications can be mapped. The forces behind them can be mapped, so that escape routes can be identified, you could say. So any assembled state of assembled components implies a state of forces that can be expressed by a map, that can be mapped out, that can be presented in the form of a map, showing how they work, not representing what they are. And it doesn't have to be to scale, etc. Okay. Those are two more diagrams, not from the Faciality Plateau. I do have to say those are from the Many Regimes of Signs, but I included those because because of the last numbered point for each one. Stratifications, assemblages can be stratified by way of principles of forces that stratify them, operate and impose principles of identity and representation. These same assemblages can be destratified, disorganized, disaggregated, or their hierarchies can be collapsed. So the stratification and the destratification of these assemblages, which is their organization and their dissolution by way of identity, involve deterritorializations, reterritorializations. The deterritorializations are seen as lines of flight, ligne de fuite, which could also be translated as lines of escape. And I think there's a description of it that Deleuze and Guattari give, which essentially means a line of flight is legging it, right? It's like getting away, it's running off, it's escaping. So that's what those lines of flight are, what stratifications seek to capture in some way. They are also part of the diagram. So the diagram of force relations that are realized in these assemblages also include these lines that are escaping or that offer escape, because no configuration of forces can hold all of its forces together. There's a centrifugal, they fly apart aspect to them, precisely because they involve resistances. There are always resistances imminent to force relations. So they're found in the assemblages. They're found in they can be diagrammed. These lines of flight are found at the cutting edges, they say, of the assemblages. And so that's why each of those diagrams, and those are diagrams of two forms of signification, one form I should say, of two regimes of signs. That's actually what they are diagrams of two regimes of signs, one of which is a signifying form, and one of which is a subjectifying form. And each of those end arrows is a line of escape from them. And they will, those two ideas, signification and subjectivation, will figure into the faciality plateau. But those diagrams aren't in the faciality plateau. So there are deterritorializations and there are reterritorializations, destratifications, restratifications. In Anti-Oedipus, the language was that capitalism executed a partial deterritorialization of desire at a molar level and reterritorialized it at a molecular level, so that the real thing is capitalism was all about releasing desire by submitting it to market forces, but holding it together at a kind of psychological level by creating neurotics who would consume, and by creating guilty subjects who will essentially pay back their debts. So capitalism did not execute a complete deterritorialization. So partial and complete are the terms in Anti-Oedipus. In 1,000 Plateaus, it's relative and absolute. But added to that is positive and negative. So there can be relative deterritorializations which tend to move you from one stratified assemblage to another, or from one kind of stratification of an assemblage to another. They're relative rather than absolute. Absolute deterritorializations, which would be unconditional, you could say, absolute meaning unconditional, could be seen as complete deterritorializations, but they can be positive or they can be negative. Now, this is one of the central issues in criticism of Deleuze and Guattari, is they won't tell you, or they can't really tell you, except in a very vague sense, what's a positive deterritorialization, what's a negative one. And they say that they can't give you rules for them. But negative forms, ultimately they link to some kind of fascism. It can be at the level of the state, it can be at the level of the individual. It's where a line of flight becomes a line of death or a line of abolition. It's a kind of nihilism that the escape could lead you to, the dead end. Whereas positive ones are at least seen as being, if liberating might not quite be the right word, But as a returning desire to its force of positive proliferation, and therefore of establishing connections and proliferating those connections. So that's kind of what's at stake in all of these movements, I should say, becomings, better term than movements, the ways in which assemblages can become through territorialization, deterritorialization, stratification, destratification, relative and absolute. Okay? Now there are 3 stratifications as well. Yeah, we'll go into these. I think I can cover them reasonably well. And then we can take a break after that. The organism, the signifier, and subjectification. Sorry, I should have said. So there are three key stratifications that compose us. Organism, signification, subjectification. They are the 3 main ways in which identitarian or identity-based organizations are imposed upon us. Imposed upon the body, upon the unconscious, and upon the conscious subject. The last one being the form of the I or the ego, the subject that consciously recognizes itself as an I. The middle one, the unconscious, the stratification of the unconscious, that's signification. So that's also involves language. The stratification of the unconscious and the stratification of language go together. Okay? So we'll start with the great organic stratification, the stratification that turns the body, so to speak, into an organism. And that's opposed to that other term from Anti-Oedipus, which is the body without organs. Okay? Body without organs, which can also be thought, and we'll get back to this later in the lecture, as a body without organization, as opposed to a body without components, or without differences within it, differences that function within it. Our bodies get stratified in a certain kind of way by being turned into an organism. All right? And that's an organism that always takes the form of ultimately will take the form of an organized body within a collection of other bodies. But how do these transitions take place? Well, part of this is put in evolutionary terms. So there's a deterritorialization that transforms the paw into a hand. Our standing upright eventually releases our forepaws to become hands, to become arms and hands. Turns the head into a face. And so a face which is expressive and which can use language. So the voice becomes language, the mouth becomes a speaking box. The mouth speaking, becoming an organ that speaks and communicates, deterritorializes it, they say, from its original function, which was simply to eat, to consume. So these are transformations that take place, and they're put, as I say, in the terms of evolution, but they necessarily involve ways in which the human body is not only stratified as an individual body, but as a collective body, because all of these things are involved in allowing us to communicate as humans, and also, as I say, they not only transform the hand, the paw into a hand, they transform the things around us from sticks and so forth into tools, which we can grasp with our hands, which we can use. And that's the beginnings, they'll say, of an organization of the human body, which then further has to be disciplined through various forms of training. So our bodies get trained in all sorts of ways, and that has to do with us being social animals, right, and human animals as well. Standing and sitting, chairs don't exist in nature. That's not a particularly natural, I would suggest to you, thing to do. Going upstairs. These are little ways in which our bodies are trained, in which we're disciplined, right? It is a matter of discipline to be able to sit in a chair. It's a matter of discipline to be able to use equipment and so forth. So the body gets organized, and it gets organized in this way into an organism where the different parts have different functions. But an organism that fits into a larger collective kind of machinery. So the body has to be disciplined to become, for example, a factory worker's body, right? They get the individual body can be incorporated into, and incorporate, that's important term, incorporate as in core, the body, into a larger body, a military body, a productive body, so forth. So that's what it does. The disciplining of the body turns it into a cog, into larger social machines, machines for production, machines for war, so forth, where the human body is plugged into various assemblages, and its own powers get extended by equipment, so forth. The Deleuze and Guattari make reference to Dogon metalsmiths, which are in West Africa, I think. But these are ancient, primitive peoples that had developed metallurgy some 3,000 years ago, we think. And so in Africa is probably, I think, considered the earliest part of the world, the part of the world that developed metallurgy first. So they make mention of, and Dogon metalsmiths were still practicing, I think, until like the 60s or 70s, carrying out these ancient forms of work, which involved, as they say here, the metalsmith takes on the organization of an organism, insofar as, quote, the shock of the hammer and the anvil broke his arms and legs at the elbows and the knees until that moment he had not possessed. In that way he received the articulations of specific to the new human form that was to spread across the earth in the form of dedicated work. So metallurgy, you have to have a tool, you have to have a hammer, you have to hit it in a certain kind of way. These aren't particularly natural. The body is trained. The body is disciplined. And it goes without saying, disciplinary practices are ancient. Even if disciplinary society, as Foucault says, is modern. So the disciplining of the body turns the body into an organized body or into an organism for specific tasks. Okay? That's the first stratification, the stratification of our bodies. Then we have the stratification of language and the unconscious. Signification molds language into a representational form, a form that signifies, that carries meaning, by consolidating meaning in relation to a transcendent signifier. That is, in Lacan, the idea of the master signifier expressed by the power of the Father, the power which prohibits desire, so forth. And it stratifies the unconscious to the extent that, as Lacan tries to argue, the unconscious is structured as a language. But it's structured as a language, Deleuze and Guattari say, because it's been stratified by this notion of signification. So unconscious desires will signify lacks that the subject revolves around, but they will be lacks standing in relation to something, a despotic force that prohibits, that carries a power of prohibition. The despotic signifier, the master signifier. Or the despot as described in Anti-Oedipus in the second social machine. So that's the second one. Language seen as signifying language, organized by as a signifying form, stratifies the unconscious. Then the third one is subjectivation, or subjectification. It varies in the translation, and it gets translated in different ways, so this is why I'm bouncing between them, and I realize now that I didn't check how it's done in 1,000 Plateaus itself. Subjectification stratifies us into conscious subjects, and this could refer to the subject as the speaking subject, as the disciplined subject, and so forth. But it's always a dual form of subjectification, or subjectivation, because the subject is both free and subjected, as we talked about in the lecture in one of the lectures on Foucault, the one on History of Sexuality, Volume 1. So it involves two subjects, because your subjectivity is always formed in relation to another subject, which is the authoritative subject to which you are subordinate, and involves this duality of being free and subjected at the same time. So those are the three stratifications. Now, the distinction between stratification of the unconscious and stratification of consciousness is going to turn into the difference between despotism and authoritarianism. Despotism is the tyrannical, unidirectional power relation, the power of prohibition. Authoritarianism is hierarchical, but it's reciprocal. So authority always involves the authority doesn't have authority unless the subordinates give them authority, whereas the despot, well, needs an army and a military force and so forth. But the despot's subjects don't give him his despotic power. It's his military, it's his soldiers, it's his armed forces that give him, or I guess her. You can have women despots, their power. So it's unidirectional. But the difference between despotism and authoritarianism, that's also going to be part of the faciality plateau, because it's despotic in the authoritarian faces. Okay? Now, in truth, all three of these strata are always wrapped up in one another. They're really inseparable. Every society, every social machine that Deleuze and Guattari talk about, the primitive, the despotic, the capitalist, from anti-Oedipus, they all involve all three stratifications: organizations of the body, organizations of the unconscious, organizations of consciousness. It can nevertheless be useful to isolate some of them, to put one or two of the strata in relative isolation. And that's what Deleuze and Guattari will do in the faciality plateau. They will focus on signification and subjectivation and the links between them, and they will largely ignore the stratification of the organism, the disciplining of the body to make it a cog in a machine. And that's going to allow them to isolate faciality as something that occurs in the transitions between, in the relation between signification and subjectivation. That should have said that. It shouldn't say between signification and stratification. It should have said signification and subjectivation. And it's going to allow them to assert a thesis, which is that in modern society, those are the two strata that are in a sense, take the lead, in a sense, the most important. That there's a stratification of the organism that takes place, but it's determined by the relationships, it's determined by the requirements, subjectification, signification. And that point is not dissimilar to Foucault, who says that modern society, in being disciplinary, it does have a focus on the body, but the focus on the body is to get to the soul. So really, the disciplining of the body is subordinated to the ultimate task of getting at our souls. And here it's similar. The organization of the body is going to be subordinate to the requirements of the more subtle forms of power involved in shaping consciousness, language, and the unconscious. And that's why it's important to isolate faciality, important to isolate stratification and signification. Subjectivation and signification. Because that's where the forms of stratification that define contemporary society in a much more subtle way and give it the kind of subtlety of its organization that maybe didn't exist in previous social forms. That's where it's to be found. So, yes, this is a good place to stop. It's under 40 minutes. So we're going to stop here and then pick up on the abstract machine of faciality. See you in the next part.